The US Treasury Secretary says Bitcoin is a store of value, just like gold. Here on Tucker Carlson, real bombs are being dropped. He is launching an active attack against the Federal Reserve, saying that the Federal Reserve is pushing DIY and enforcing regulatory measures as well as climate change. This is absolutely mind-blowing. We need to watch this highly explosive interview on Tucker Carlson to see what other bombs are being dropped. He also touches on gold. He mentions that in China, people are circumventing capital controls with gold, but that this could potentially also be possible with Bitcoin. That means we now not only have Elon Musk calling to end the Fed, but we also have the US Secretary of the Treasury saying, hey, what's happening with the Federal Reserve isn't really quite top-notch and so on. It's really, really strange what's going on there. He's definitely being asked here, hey, what's going on with the Fed? Then he really laid it out on the table that the Federal Reserve is a very, very questionable institution. And these statements are extremely explosive because Scott actually said the following in an interview, not only before his election, but especially before Donald Trump's election. He said, in the coming years, we will experience a kind of comprehensive economic reorganization, something like a new Bretton Woods. The chances are good that this will happen in the next 4 years, and I want to be a part of it. And it's very, very important, before we watch the interview or look at the excerpts, I selected the best excerpts that Scott Bessent really wants to build a new monetary system. Scott Bessent also talks about not wanting a debt-based monetary system anymore, but rather an asset-based monetary system, meaning that a sovereign wealth fund would be used to build assets like a Bitcoin stockpile and so on. And potentially, the aim is to relieve the USA of debt, while simultaneously building a new monetary system. Now listen to what Scott Bessent has to say here on Tucker Carlson.
It was unclear whether we were going to exempt gold from tariffs, which I believe we have. So there was a big move out of vaults in Switzerland, out of vaults in London to get it into New York. And look, that there are a lot of different stores of value over time. Bitcoin's becoming a store of value. Gold has historically been a store of value. I think what's interesting is, where do we see the gold demand coming from? A huge amount is from China.
Yes.
Where they, as I said, they're in the middle of an economic recession/depression. People don't trust the Chinese currency because they have capital controls. There are 1.4 billion Chinese who all want to get their money out, and they won't let them. They will let them buy gold.
And here are some really explosive statements. First, he says here that Bitcoin is clearly a store of value, just like gold. And a lot of people are still asleep. They are not dealing with Bitcoin. And here in the USA, Donald Trump, the Treasury Secretary, everyone is talking about it. That Bitcoin is not only being added to the stockpile, but it definitely has all the store of value properties needed to be equated with gold here. And now he's also talking about gold. And we need to take a very close look at that, because he's talking about the transfers that are happening from England to New York, that the Bank of England is having massive problems, that it sometimes takes 3 months or so for gold to be shipped here. And he says there are definitely large gold transports. This is also related to the fact that people speculated that tariffs would be imposed, but the tariffs were not implemented, according to Scott Bessent. But what he didn't mention here is that there are still speculations that many gold transfers are happening because Fort Knox is apparently supposed to be refilled, as it is supposed to be audited. And if there's no gold here, then Fort Knox might need to be refilled again. In any case, he says there is also a very, very large demand for gold. All the Chinese want to buy gold because they don't trust the Chinese currency. There are 1.4 billion people here who potentially want to get out of the currency, and they are using gold to circumvent capital controls. But beware. He also mentions Bitcoin in the same breath. And Bitcoin is a much, much better vehicle to circumvent capital controls. He didn't explicitly mention it now, but maybe that's why he mentioned Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is the ultimate, let's say, escape asset if you want to flee. There is no better asset than Bitcoin for this purpose. You can theoretically cross a border naked, take all your Bitcoin assets with you. And now the interview gets even more interesting. So we've established that the finance minister is bullish on Bitcoin, clearly stating it's a store of value and so on. And now it's about the Federal Reserve. The finance minister is now being asked, what is his take on the Federal Reserve? And now it gets highly explosive.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a weird question? Who runs the Federal Reserve exactly?
How can you have such an extremely pivotal institution that has the most significantly effective impact on the markets in the world?
Really, how can you have this pivotal institution that obviously has the most direct effect on markets of any, and it does seem outside of political control? What is that?
Well, look, I think that during my confirmation hearing, and I was actually at a dinner that Jerome Powell was at last night. At my confirmation hearing, I said, I'm only going to talk about the mistakes the Federal Reserve has made in
The Federal Reserve is completely independent. On the other hand, they have complete influence. And how can it be that this is outside of political control? And now, Scott actually says here in the first response he gives in his first words that he had dinner last night with Jerome Powell, the Fed chief. You can already see that it can't be completely independent. That means the independence, that's always an idea people have about the Federal Reserve. But he actually asks him here, hey, how does it look with independence? And the first thing here, Scott Bessent says, yeah, hey, we had dinner together with the Fed chief yesterday. And so we're supposedly so independent, but we definitely had dinner here. That means it can't be completely independent. That means politics and the Fed are somewhat connected here. On the other hand, there is a certain independence because we know that Donald Trump wants to lower the interest rates. But Jerome Powell doesn't listen to Donald Trump here.
I'm going to talk about the mistakes the Federal Reserve has made in the past. I won't talk about the ones they're going to make in the future, right? But I think it is important for monetary policy that they are walled off, that some of the other things they do, regulation, they got into DEI, they got into climate, I actually think that impinges on their monetary policy and makes them vulnerable.
A very clear attack against the central bank, saying here, they should not interfere. Regulation in DY, in climate, and so on. Furthermore, this makes them very vulnerable here, and the same applies to the ECB. I mean, I was so shocked they used to do monetary policy here, and now the ECB is making posts about some climate issues and somehow LGBTQ. And who knows what else they're doing, so have they really shifted their mandate now? That means it used to be just about money, stability, or price stability. One must say, in the USA, price stability, additionally securing jobs, but now they have shifted their mandate so much that suddenly they're talking about climate and who knows what else. I mean, weather and other things, also regulation. We'll get into that here, banks getting involved. In any case, he says here, they are at risk of losing their relevance here.
Makes them vulnerable. So I think that they should focus on monetary policy, doing the best that they can for the American economy, the American people, keeping inflation low, and then the rest, there are a lot of other banking agencies too.
So the Fed controls the weather now?
Yes, here he also says what I just said. That means monetary policy, that's what they should do, but the rest, they shouldn't focus on that.
And then the rest, there are a lot of other banking agencies too.
So the Fed controls the weather now too? What were they doing with climate?
Well, I will tell you, there's something that the Treasury Secretary chairs something called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, and it's all the financial regulators. And I think it was 2 weeks before Silicon Valley Bank went under, FSOC issued a report. And guess what they said the biggest risk to the financial system was? Climate.
Really?
Not that there was a large bank in California that was having a slow motion run on its assets and that it would cause another bank failure, then another bank failure. It was climate. So as far as I can see, climate's been pretty good. They failed. The regulators failed. And I think that's what people are getting sick of. And it's back to one of my favorite phrases that President Trump uses, common sense.
Yes.
Look, it's just common sense that if you have a whole bunch of deposits that could leave your bank with a click, you shouldn't have all these long-term assets, but they were too busy worrying about the weather. And there was also some degree of regulatory capture. Seems hard to believe to the average citizen. The CEO of Silicon Valley Bank was on the board of the San Francisco Federal Reserve, who was his chief regulator. They're going to tell that guy what to do?
Here, Scott Bessent actually says, people here are getting sick of the Federal Reserve. They're getting sick. So they're slowly getting fed up with what the Federal Reserve is doing here. And then Tucker Carlson also says, yeah, are they controlling the climate here now and so on. And now comes the big shocker. The finance minister actually says here, yes, when there were problems with the Silicon Valley Bank and they were on the verge of a bank run. And nowadays it's digital. You can just withdraw your money with a click. And then the assets here were simply worth nothing anymore. And then people realized, okay, you have to withdraw the money. And then there was this, what's it called here, Financial Stability Oversight Council. And then they apparently had nothing else on their radar except to think about the climate. They said the biggest problem now is the climate. We have a potential bank run at our doorstep, But the biggest problem here is the climate. And that's the perversity where things have drifted that suddenly you're not doing your core job anymore. And they can't even manage that here to ensure price stability. And that's what I always say, hey, the Fed chief has 20,000 employees and there are more every year. They still can't get it done. And then when they can't manage it, they take on a second job. They also take care of the climate. And it's just absurd. It's all just one big, yes, big scam and so on with all this climate stuff. And it's now quite obvious that it's a big scam and it's just here, an ideology that is being pushed through here. And then he also says here that Donald Trump says we need to return to common sense. So just simple logic and so on. Focus on the basics here and not open any side issues. And now there's a very exciting part at the end where he actually puts direct pressure on the Federal Reserve.
I was a freshman in college when Ronald Reagan came in 1980, and new day in America. And when I talk to people now and they look back and they look at the Reagan years so fondly,
Yes.
I remember what it was like, and it was choppy. And the president...
Very choppy.
Very choppy. President Reagan stood the course. And look, this is not an invitation, but at one point in the early 80s, a farmer showed up with a shotgun at the Federal Reserve to kill Paul Volcker for raising rates. So, like I said, that's not an invitation for anybody for action, but it was a tough time. And then in 1984, President Reagan won re-election with 49 states. And I think they may have even let Mondale win Minnesota just so it wasn't a skunk.
Just to be nice, yeah.
And that's what President Trump is doing now.
Policies that Reagan also made very, very strong cuts at the beginning, like with the Department of Government Efficiency and so on. But afterwards, he brought the whole thing to a very, very good conclusion. And Donald Trump wants to do something similar now. And then there's the striking part here where he tells the story of Paul Volcker. Because back then, it was like that. There were also problems. Then Paul Volcker simply overnight raised the interest rates to, I don't know, double-digit levels or something, or very, very high levels. I'm not exactly sure how high it was then. In any case, it was an absurd increase, like if you were to raise interest rates by 5% overnight, which is unimaginable today. But what happened back then? That was the case, and then people came with shotguns, or at least one person did, and threatened Paul Volcker. And we're seeing something similar now in the USA, except that people aren't going to Jerome Powell with a shotgun and saying, hey, lower the interest rates, but instead, Donald Trump is coming. Not with a shotgun, but at least on Twitter and such, and saying lower the interest rates. There's definitely a certain reference here, drawing a parallel between Volcker and now between Jerome Powell. Back then, there was the threat with the shotgun, now there's the threat from Donald Trump. Maybe he said it unintentionally, maybe it was a slip of the tongue or something. I don't know. In any case, it's highly explosive what's happening here. The whole thing is also highly explosive for Bitcoin. He definitely confirmed Bitcoin as a store of value. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link below for you. 21 Bitcoin, how you can buy Bitcoin easily, safely, and simply. With the code, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. Highly recommended. Be sure to check it out. It's highly recommended for beginners, advanced users, and many people here. Absolutely. My recommendation to you. And then also a big shout out, the TREZOR birthday sales are happening right now. So there are special discounts at TREZOR, and with the code Bitcoin Hotel, there's an additional discount. And if you use the link below, you can easily browse through all the discounts available here. There are bundles and much more available. So definitely check out TREZOR if you want to buy a hardware wallet. See you until then. Peace out.